Ishiro Honda once said that the tragedy of monsters is the fact that they are born too tall, too strong, and too heavy. And at least in the context of the films, he was right. These attributes have led to Godzilla having many disagreements with the Japanese military. But at least in the context of pop culture, these attributes have led to the opposite for Godzilla. They've allowed him to prosper and produce 28 movies. But I want to analyze this and discover what it truly is about Godzilla that attracts people to him and why he's been so endearing. And the only way to truly do that successfully is to review every Godzilla movie ever made. Some people might be angry, but regardless, welcome to Zazubar's Godzilla Palooza. Salutations, fire monsters. I am Zazubar, and welcome back to Godzilla Palooza. It's day 3, and today we're going to finally leave behind the trimmings of the original Gojira and finally get into some new material and the sequels that the original Gojira spawned. And today we're going to start with the first sequel, the one released only 1 year later after Honda's masterpiece had struck the people of Japan. Today we're going to be reviewing Godzilla Raids Again. Yes, indeed. The 1955 attempted sequel at Honda's impeccable masterpiece. So, yes, this film was indeed released the following year and was being made nearly immediately after Honda had released Gojira. And, in fact, that's going to be part of the criticism of this film, is that it's frickin' rushed. Yeah, this movie is rushed beyond all hell. It just feels so quickly put together to follow the financial and critical success of Honda's original, mainly in Japan. I don't think the film, we'll talk about when this movie gets released overseas, but we're talking about just Japan right now. Honda's Gojira was a big success. People were lining up around blocks to get tickets. Critics were raving about it. It was being put on top films of Japan list, and now Toho, being the film giant that it is, has to release a sequel. And a couple weeks after Gojira was, breaking Japanese box office records, they finally just said, "We're just going to do a sequel," and they started shooting it not very long after that. The big things I want to cover about the production of Godzilla Raids Again is that Honda isn't involved. I'm not exactly sure why Honda doesn't direct this, or at least isn't a creative consultant or anything. I don't think his his name is even on this film. But Honda is not involved at all. And neither is the original music composer Akira Ifukube. So that's two big heavy losses right there, and right to the film's disadvantage. Again, I don't know why they didn't return, but it definitely isn't good that they didn't, because the film definitely was hurting because of that. I would imagine it's because they didn't think Gojira needed the sequel, or maybe it's just because they didn't like the script, or I'm not exactly sure, but they're not involved. The returning people that come from the original Gojira and carry over to Godzilla Raids Again is Haruo Nakajima as Godzilla, Takashi Shimura returning as Dr. Yamane, although his role is more of a cameo than an actual, major role. We've got Tomoyuki Tanaka returning as producer, Eiji Tsuburaya returning as doing the effects. Now, Subraya will always be involved until his unfortunate passing in 1970. So I'm not going to specifically say that he's involved in each film, but I think hopefully you guys will just gather that, because until we get to Godzilla vs. Hedorah, Subraya is involved. So just putting that out there. And then we also get Shigeru Kayama returning to write the story. I don't think, again, he didn't write the screenplay, he just came up with the story. And that's going to be another problem when we get into it later. When we get into the plot more. So we have a lot of the original Gojira's production team returning, but we're missing two big people with Ifukube and Honda, so that's, again, it's definitely to the film's disadvantage. With all of that out of the way, I think it's time we got into the plot of Godzilla Raids Again. What exactly can the good people of Toho come up with to stand up to Honda's classic? Actually, before we get into the plot, sorry I'm kind of jumping all over the place today, because I actually have a lot to say about this movie, and I'm not quite sure where to begin. Before we jump into the plot, I just want to say that I was actually really excited to see this movie again, because it had been a while since I've seen the original Japanese version, because I only saw it once, and I never saw it again after that. And I've been watching the American cut for a couple years now, so I've been kind of, again, kind of like what happened with King of the Monsters, I've been starved of the Japanese cut of Godzilla Raids Again. So I just want to say that I was disappointed. And I think that will kind of sum up how the Japanese felt about this movie when it was released as well, because this is a very disappointing movie. And it comes on that for two main things. One of them is that the movie was just so rushed and came out immediately after the big, huge, incredible movie of Gojira. And also, it was disappointing for me because I've been hearing people telling me that the movie isn't as bad as the reputation is. So I was a little excited to be kind of surprised about this movie, because I didn't like it the first time I saw it, even the Japanese version. So I was also disappointed that I didn't like it as much as I would have liked to, because again, it's been a while. I didn't really know what to expect. So I was definitely disappointed with what I actually saw, and probably on the same way the Japanese audience felt when they first saw this movie. So with all that unfortunate build up to the review out of the way, let's get into the plot. So, what exactly can the good people of Toho cook up for a sequel to Honda's original? Well, let's find out. The plot is surprisingly a lot simpler than the original Gojira, and that's mostly because a lot of the intricate details I mentioned are cut out. There's not a lot of subplots, and the subplots that are there are so small and underdeveloped that all we really have here is the A story, which is Godzilla returning. So as the title suggests, Godzilla does indeed raid again. We open with two, I'm not really sure what to call them, air spotters, I'm going to call them, basically two pilots who basically fly over the Japanese Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, that sounded weird, the Pacific Ocean, and spot schools of fish for these big, huge fisherman boats to come by and catch them. And they're named Tsukioka and Kobayashi. And Kobayashi, and they're both best friends. And Kobayashi's engine breaks down one day, and he crashes on an island called, he lands Iwato Island. That's the name of the island, excuse me. You can tell I was so prepared for this. No, I have a lot to say about this movie, and I don't know where to begin. So he crash lands on Iwato Island, and Tsukioka is told about this and goes after him. He lands on Iwato Island to find Kobayashi hurt, but alive and well. Although his plane is completely just a goner. So they have some banter. Kobayashi's arm gets a nice wrap because it got twisted or something when he crash landed. And then all of a sudden, everything on Iwato Island goes silent. And the two look up and see these two enormous monsters fighting. One of them is, of course, Godzilla, and then the other one is a new monster named Anguirus. And these two monsters are locked in just deadly combat. They don't even notice the humans. They're just totally focused on killing each other. Kobayashi and Tsukioka duck into a cave, and then they make a run for Tsukioka's plane when the two monsters fall into the sea. So the two return to Japan and give their report on what they saw, mainly just saying that Godzilla has returned. And Dr. Yamane is brought in from Tokyo to, I guess, kind of, I don't want to say compliment, but to verify their report and see what they're saying and see if this is actually Godzilla, and he does ultimately agree, yeah, it's another Godzilla. And it is said that this is not the same Godzilla that attacked Tokyo the previous year. This is a different monster. I mean, it's still a Godzilla, but it's not the same monster. But then they also give the report that they saw Godzilla fighting another monster, and they go through some dinosaur photos and find a drawing of a creature called an Ankylosaurus, which looks nothing like the real thing, since it is actually a real dinosaur. And we learn that the monster's other name is Anguirus. So, that's the way it's said in the movie. I say it Anguirus, but that's the way the film says it, so I'm going to call him Anguirus in this review. So, two paleontologists are there. Again, Dr. Yamane is there, mainly just there to talk about Godzilla. He doesn't really have anything to say about Anguirus, but there's another paleontologist there, actually from the city of Osaka, where the entire film takes place, and he is there to give us exposition about what Anguirus is and why he's a threat. We'll get into why this is stupid in a few minutes, but basically he just says that him and Godzilla are both natural enemies, that they'll just continue to fight until one kills the other, or until they both die. Then Dr. Yamane starts to talk about what the previous Godzilla did to Tokyo, and we see some stock footage from Gojira about what happened in Tokyo. And then there's a lot of filler, where the military is basically just trying to locate Godzilla and Anguirus and find out where they're going to make landfall, since of course they've got to attack Japan. So there's a lot of scenes of the military looking for Godzilla and Anguirus, and they basically deduce that they're going to land on the shores of Osaka, because that's where our movie takes place. So Godzilla does make landfall, but Dr. Yamane says that there's no way they're going to be able to kill him without the oxygen destroyer, which again is impossible to recreate. So I also like how that Serizawa's mentioned, but he doesn't, you know, of course he's dead, so he doesn't get a cameo or anything. But Serizawa is mentioned. So he says that there's no way to kill Godzilla, but there might be a way to keep him offshore by using flares thrown from planes to distract Godzilla and keep him offshore. I want to get back to this idea in a second when we get into Godzilla's characteristics in this film, but the flares are deployed, and of course Godzilla does come into Osaka shores a couple of weeks later during nightfall, and a nationwide blackout is there, so that way Godzilla will only see the flares as the only source of light. So Godzilla does go after the flares and stays off the shores of Osaka, but until a van carrying a group of prisoners crashes into a gas station, and well, basically what happened is the prisoners knock out all the cops in the van, they steal a truck, and then there's a chase scene, the truck crashes into a gas station or something. I think it might be an oil foundry, I'm not sure. They crash into something flammable, there's a big explosion. Godzilla's distracted and goes after that source of light, so now Godzilla's invading Osaka. The military tries to fight Godzilla, of course it doesn't do anything. They use tanks and missiles and planes and stuff. And it's a pretty impressive military Godzilla fight scene, but nothing special. Then Anguirus comes ashore, and they try to kill him too, but they can't keep him and Godzilla apart, so then we've got a big fight underway between Godzilla and Anguirus, which basically leads to Osaka being demolished. They fight for about, I guess, 10 minutes, and then Godzilla ends up killing Anguirus, and after Anguirus is dead, Godzilla leaves the city, and of course Osaka is just in ruin. There's a dead Anguirus, just a mess. So there's a lot of filler after this, a lot of human scenes, and again the military are looking for Godzilla. And there's a really like a good like half hour before they find him. It's kind of awkward. We'll talk about that in a second. So they Tsukioka eventually finds Godzilla again scouting in his plane, and he finds out that he has returned, well, not returned, but he's gone to another island, and it doesn't necessarily say that it's Iwato Island, but the way the island looks, I think we can assume that he's back on Iwato Island. So the military goes after Godzilla and attempts to attack him with planes, but of course this doesn't do anything. So they come up with a plan after, Kobayashi goes after Godzilla too, and Kobayashi is unfortunately shot down by Godzilla with his heat beam. And Kobayashi crashes into the mountain, knocks down a strip of the mountain, which almost kills, well, doesn't kill him, but almost buries Godzilla alive. So this gives Tsukioka and the military a plan to use rockets to bombard the side of the mountain and bury Godzilla under ice. So they attempt to do just that, and after some trials and tribulations, it eventually works. After some pilots die, and some foot soldiers have the crap scared out of them, Godzilla is buried, and Tsukioka and his supporting cast are left to mourn the loss of Kobayashi, who kind of like Serizawa had a heroic sacrifice, but it's awkward. We'll get to Kobayashi in a second. So then the film ends on a pretty stereotypical monster movie note of an optimistic, we killed the monster kind of ending. Although Godzilla isn't actually dead, just again buried alive. So as you notice, this plot is a lot simpler than the original Gojira, and there's a lot less details to it. It basically is just the A story of Godzilla coming back and attacking Osaka and fighting Anguirus. I didn't mention any of the human drama on purpose because there isn't any, or very little to even mention. Basically, we get two characters who are clearly in love with each other. We get Hidemi and our lead Tsukioka, who are engaged, and Tsukioka is this fishing company's big hotshot pilot, and she's the manager of the factory's daughter. So they're engaged, and Kobayashi is Tsukioka's best friend. And there's very little drama between them. It's just a lot of the scenes of them making jokes, and they're likable people. They just don't have any, they're not really interesting, except for Kobayashi a little later in the film. But it takes a while for Kobayashi to become interesting. A lot of it is just entertaining but dull banter between. That sounds weird. Entertaining but ultimately pointless banter between him and Tsukioka. Ultimately, just the human characters don't have much interesting about them, unlike the cast of the original Gojira. They don't have anything allegorical or even really interesting about them. They're just kind of there for people to be terrified of Godzilla. Really, the only human drama that erupts in the film comes way later and isn't really even brought to the surface, but it's basically just a love triangle again between Kobayashi, Tsukioka, and Hidemi, but it's less interesting because the other two are already engaged, and she clearly has no feelings for Kobayashi, but Kobayashi loves her anyway, and is still Tsukioka's friend anyway. I mean, it makes Kobayashi a likable and, somewhat sympathetic character, but he's still boring. All the characters are, and again, there's just no conflict in this movie, at least on the human scale. So when we've got like a half hour of no Godzilla and just the humans, it's painfully boring, and the film drags like nobody's business. It ultimately has not giant ant syndrome, but it has B monster movie disease, I'm going to call it, in that it tries to make the human characters likable and somewhat succeeds, but there's nothing interesting about them, and it just leaves us wanting the monsters to show up. So ultimately, I'm going to come down to the plot of this movie as it feels just like a 50s B movie in America, in that all the people are not very, there's no human conflict, and ultimately the film is just poorly paced. There's so many chunks of just scenes of the humans being happy, and that doesn't work for a monster movie. The grim tone of Gojira is totally lost. We just get nothing. It's just all happiness and optimism, and I don't want that in a Godzilla movie unless it's there for an allegorical or thematic reason. It's just kind of they don't seem to care that the monsters are destroying stuff. I mean, there are shots where they look kind of sad looking at the destroyed cities, but nothing beyond that. When they're talking in dialogue, there's nothing grim about it. It's just them being happy, and I don't like that in a Godzilla movie, especially in one that's trying to be a sequel to Gojira and ultimately has a very similar plot, just with another monster thrown in, and it just doesn't work as a sequel to Gojira. It's too optimistic. So the plot, it's too simple. There's too much filler, and all of it's boring filler. None of it's interesting at all, like it is in Gojira. None of the human characters are very interesting. And ultimately, the film is poorly paced, leaving you just waiting for the monsters to show up. And that half hour before the ending, I wanted to kill myself. I was so bored because I couldn't. There was nothing I could enjoy about it. It was just people laughing. And, you have to watch the movie to know what I'm saying, but there's just so many scenes of Kobayashi and Tsukioka just hanging out with old Air Force buddies and talking and laughing and getting drunk, and it's just not interesting. Maybe if there was something else going on during that, it could be, but there's nothing. The film just seems to be stalling for time until Godzilla can show up. Now let's get on to the thing that's missing in this movie. Allegory. People have tried to overanalyze Godzilla Raids Again and try to extract some sort of meaning from, especially the scenes where Godzilla fights Anguirus. But listen, there's nothing. I am the most over-analytical, there's nothing there, but I'm going to say there's something there anyway kind of reviewer, but I can legitimately tell you there is nothing in Godzilla Raids Again worth analyzing. People have tried to take from this film that Godzilla is representative of America and Anguirus is representative of Russia. And when they're fighting, and the fact that there's natural enemies, it's just that it's supposed to be representative of the arms race in the Cold War. I don't see it at all. Not at all. It's just two monsters beating the hell out of each other. There's nothing there. There's nothing to deduce that those two monsters represent that. You could switch that metaphor around and it would be the same thing. It doesn't work. And the other thing is that the nuclear allegory is only there because it's Godzilla's origin. This film has giant ant syndrome with Godzilla because Godzilla is just a monster born from the H-bomb with nothing, there's no radiation sickness in this film. And the strange thing is that the fishing industry is a big part of the plot, but there's nothing about radioactive fish or contaminated fish. There's nothing. And it's a big missed opportunity to have that be part of the movie. So I have to criticize it for that, because it's a total missed opportunity, and taking something as comprehensive as Gojira and giving it a sequel that is just a basic monster movie with giant ant syndrome is almost an insult to Honda's original. So this movie infuriates me for that. Because they take Godzilla, who is this interesting product of the H-bomb, and turn him into just a monster. And that's disappointing. So I'm very disappointed that there's no allegory in this movie. I think there ultimately could have been. Again, having the fishing industry be a big part of the plot's a good idea, just nothing's done with it. So again, not much to say about the allegory. There's really nothing to analyze here. If you want to take something from Godzilla and Anguirus fighting each other, I'm sorry, but you're overanalyzing it and there's nothing there. I think ultimately without Honda, the allegory can't be there. I mean, there will be future Godzilla films made that aren't directed by Honda that have allegory in them, but I think without Honda to push that in this film, there's nothing. I think the big reason we had a lot of allegory in Gojira is because Honda wanted it, and he had a lot to say with the premise. This director, Motoyoshi Ada, really has nothing to say with it. I think that he's just making it a monster movie for the sake of entertainment and for money. I really don't feel like he has anything to say with it, like Honda did with Gojira. So again, that's almost insulting to Honda's original film. I think this movie really needed him to have that allegorical force. and it doesn't have him, so it doesn't have the allegorical force. So let's move on for the lack of allegory, which is basically a big problem because of what it's a sequel to. And we shall move on to the thing that is most integral about Godzilla Raids Again, the monster fight. This is indeed the first time we have Godzilla fight another giant creature. And this will become Godzilla's easily most defining trait, for better or worse. The fact that Godzilla fights other monsters will be the thing that Godzilla will be known for in pop culture. And we'll get more into that next time, but for this film, this is the first film where it's there, and I would be remiss not to talk about it. So let's get into Godzilla's first monster fight. So Godzilla's first enemy is indeed Anguirus, a mutated ankylosaurus. And the two have two fights in the film. One is the opening fight on Awato Island, which is basically just, you really don't see much of it, and it's only about 3 minutes long. Nothing is really impressive about it. It's just the two monsters ramming into each other. And then we have the final 10 to 15 minute fight in Osaka at night, where Godzilla fully fights Anguirus and in the end kills him. Anguirus has a cool design, and he's very original looking. I've never seen anything like that before, in that, sure, it's kind of based on an Ankylosaurus, but the head and the body is just so weird and creative that you can't help but enjoy looking at it, and seeing Godzilla combat that. And Anguirus is ultimately a good response to Godzilla's unique look. I think it was a good idea to not just have Godzilla fight a giant animal, but to have him fight another monster, something that looks unique. So I have to commend the film for that. My problem with Anguirus, and this is going to play into when he shows up in later films, is that he's a very bland monster, especially when he's just fighting Godzilla and there's nothing else going on with him. In this film, he is just there to give Godzilla something to fight, and he's a very bland monster for that. He really doesn't have anything interesting about him. He just kind of rams into Godzilla continuously and roars at him and knocks him down a few times, and he doesn't really get any defining characteristic. Godzilla has his atomic blast and his roar. All Anguirus has is a cool roar, and that's it. There's nothing interesting about him. He's just kind of a monstrous creature. He doesn't get any kind of tragedy or revenge characterization that Godzilla got in Gojira and continues to get in this. I'll talk about that in a minute. So I think it's disappointing for that. I think they should have spent a little more time on giving Anguirus those kind of characteristics, so he would seem more of a match for Godzilla, because there's no point where he fights Godzilla in this movie where you don't think Godzilla can win. And there's plenty of points we're going to get to where Godzilla fights another monster in this series where he has that, where you don't know how he's going to win. In this, just looking at Godzilla compared to Anguirus, it's very clear he's going to win. And it's disappointing in that regard. So Anguirus is ultimately disappointing. I do like the design, I like the roar, but I ultimately wish he had some more defining characteristics than just the roar, like Godzilla does. So, we'll get back to Anguirus in a couple movies, and he'll definitely be getting an upgrade from this. So, he's got a decent first appearance. I wish he didn't die. I just think that hurts the film's conflict, and you could use him in later and they use him anyway, but it would have been less clunky to use him in later sequels if they didn't kill him off here. And again, it hurts the film's conflict for him to be killed off so early. The last thing I want to say about Anguirus is that he's ultimately superfluous in the plot. Aside from Godzilla killing him an hour before the movie's over, I'm not kidding. He shows up for no reason. He really doesn't cause any strife to the humans. Really, the big thing is that the humans in this film are terrified of Godzilla returning, and that's it. There's no specific fear aimed at Anguirus, which we're going to get with later Godzilla films, and we get with other giant kaiju films that will spawn off from this, where the monster that the main monster fights causes his own specific problems. Anguirus doesn't really have that. He just kind of shows up to fight Godzilla. The funniest thing for me is that when Godzilla's attacking Osaka and Anguirus shows up, no one really seems any more terrified. It's just, oh, Anguirus here, and now Godzilla's going to fight something. And the only reason he seems to show up again is just for Godzilla to fight him, and that's it. And that's a little disappointing and a missed opportunity. I think it would have been cool to have Anguirus cause his own problems. So again, Anguirus is ultimately superfluous in the plot. It almost seems like they kill him off early just so we can focus on Godzilla again, so we don't have to worry about this other monster being around. So I'm disappointed with that. And it's just kind of a clunky way to put in another monster. It just seems to be like we have that one fight scene, and then the movie just wants to move on with Godzilla. I also think it's a missed opportunity not to have their fight scene at the end. Like, I feel like with a monster fight movie, you should have the fight be at the end. And I know this is the first giant kaiju monster battle movie, and that you could say that they have to perfect the formula, but here's the thing. We've had monsters fight in movies before this, with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and that movie, too, saved the fight till the end and was better for it. So I feel like this movie should have done that, and it's ultimately a little anticlimactic to have Anguirus die, and then there's still another half hour of movie to go. So, disappointing there. Well, not even half hour, more like 45 to 50 minutes left, so what the hell, Toho? So what else do I want to talk about? So, that's Anguirus. He's ultimately disappointing. He'll have better appearances in later movies. His first appearance, all he really has going for him is his look, and that's it, and his roar. His fight with Godzilla's okay, but ultimately disappointing. So let's move on to more generally the effects. Oh my god, there's such a downgrade. You can very much so tell that Sabraya was rushed with this production, because they don't take the kind of precautions they took with Gojira with the lighting and the way they shoot the suits. It's just very straightforward camera work, and that makes the suits look a lot more fake. Really the big thing that kills it for me is not the lighting or the cinematography, it's the heads on the suits. They look terrible. I don't know what happened. I don't mind you slimming down Godzilla's body so he can fight another monster, and you make a monster that's equally as slimmed down just so he can fight Godzilla. But why did you have to change the head on the thing? Fine, make it smaller so it'll fit on the suit, but don't change the design. The head is a lot narrower in this film, and it looks terrible. It looks a lot more fake. Also, Godzilla looks like a Muppet in this movie, and his head just looks very plasticky, and his mouth is always open, making him look even more fake. The eyes never move, except in one shot where it looks even worse. Oh god, Godzilla looks so bad in this movie. I just don't like the design anyway, so... Ugh. Anguirus looks fine, but again, he doesn't look really as real as Godzilla did in Gojira. And also, Anguirus' mouth hangs open more than Godzilla's does. Like, I don't think there's one shot in this movie with the suit where his mouth is closed, and it looks terrible. It almost looks like a sock puppet. Like, his mouth is just hanging open because they didn't have something to close it. I don't know. The only time we see his mouth close is when they're using the animatronic puppets, or I don't even want to call it animatronic, but they're using the puppet that we had in Gojira, but you know, they make one for Anguirus and they make a new one for Godzilla, and they both look terrible. Again, it's the lighting that kills it, where it worked in Gojira, but it just doesn't work in this movie. Also, this movie doesn't have the excuse of this was the first time Sabraya was doing this, so I'm going to start being harsher on the effects. They look terrible in this movie. And the puppets are just used way too often, and they look terrible. The effects are just such a downgrade. I really wish they would have given Sabraya more time to do it, especially since he's such a perfectionist. I think he was just ultimately disappointed with the way this movie looked. I haven't heard him say that, but I can imagine him being saying that, because Sabraya was just such a perfectionist and so hard on himself as an effects guy that I doubt that he would have liked the way this movie turned out very much. So again, the effects are just very disappointing, especially when compared to Gojira, and you can't make the same excuses for this movie that you can for Gojira. So I want to cover a couple more things. This review is starting to get a lot longer than I intended it to be, but again, I have a lot to say about this movie. So let's move on to one of the last things I want to talk about of Godzilla's characterization. As I said in the first review of this series, I want to kind of cover Godzilla's progression as a character over the years. With Raids Again, we don't get much. He's still very similar to the force of nature monster that he was in Gojira. There's just not as much. It's just not as interesting. Sorry, I'm just looking over my notes. The revenge thing is nearly dropped, except in one line where Yamane is talking about how Godzilla is attracted to bright lights because it's bringing back memories of the A-bomb explosion that turned him into Godzilla. I really like that because it gives Godzilla a tragic connection to the H-bomb, and I love that. But that's it. That's the only kind of revenge against mankind kind of moment we get for Godzilla, and that's disappointing. And ultimately, this movie, Godzilla is just a monster. There's nothing really defining about him that made him such a unique character in Gojira. In this, he's just a monster, kind of like the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. So again, very disappointing. Except for that cool line. So that's really all I have to say about the Japanese cut. I'm going to briefly touch on the American cut. So basically, that's all I wanted to say about the Japanese cut of Godzilla Raids Again. It's just a very disappointing movie. And I ultimately just wish that it wasn't as rushed, and that Godzilla wasn't downgraded from an interesting look at the atomic age into just another monster. I'm very disappointed with that, and I have to criticize the production team for that. The monster fight is okay, but ultimately disappointing, and Geras is ultimately disappointing. This movie is just downright disappointing, because it's a direct sequel to Gojira. You expect some kind of standard set by that film. So, ultimately, they should have not made the movie, or spent more time on it, or convinced Honda to come back, just something. I think the best thing would have been to spend more time on it and get Honda back, because the film just suffers so badly from each. There's one last thing I wanted to touch on regarding to Ifukube leaving. The music in this movie is really underutilized. We've got a great composer here, Masaru Sato, who will do some of the best Godzilla scores in history later on in the franchise. Like when we get to films like Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. But he's completely wasted here. He has one memorable track, which is basically the military attack theme. Ifukube has one too, but this one's a little more not as defined. It's kind of like that military montage theme you get in all Godzilla films. He has one of those, and it's pretty memorable, but again, it's not as defined. I just wish Masaru Sato was used, because he's such a talented guy. You'd want him to be overutilized, not under. So it makes this movie disappointing for that. And there's an ill use of music. Like, the first time Godzilla and Geras fight, there's no music, and it's really clunky and just not fun to watch. And the music when they fight is so generic that, again, it's just disappointing. It's just disappointing compared to Gojira, which has my favorite soundtrack in all of cinema history. And it's also disappointing because you've got a great composer with Masaru Sato, and he's completely wasted. So, the score is also disappointing. So that'll about do it for this review of Godzilla Raids Again. I guess I'll rate the film before I go to the American cut, because I want to briefly touch on that, but I'm going to give Godzilla Raids Again, the original Japanese cut, a 3 out of 5. It's just such a disappointing movie. There's good aspects about it. The human characters are, again, really likable, but just there's nothing interesting about them. And they don't have any interesting conflict to keep the movie well-paced and well-balanced, like the original Gojira had. But they are ultimately likable. And the film is ultimately entertaining as just a monster movie. Again, it's got that American B-movie charm. It's just not as complex or as good as Gojira. So it suffers from that. But again, it's an okay monster movie. So I do recommend you see it, but you're going to be disappointed. It's just an okay B movie. So a 3 out of 5 for me. Again, it's just ultimately disappointing. So let's touch on the American cut briefly. I didn't want to do a full review on it because not only is it not very different from Raids Again, but it's also not a Godzilla movie. They basically took the American company basically took Godzilla Raids Again, retitled it as Gigantus the Fire Monster, took out any ties to Godzilla, and it's no longer a Godzilla movie. And then they released it in 1959 with a full dub. And they didn't do the same thing they did with King of the Monsters by casting American actors, but a similar thing is done with narration, where there's scenes where they don't want to dub it, so they have a narrator narrate over the scene to tell us what's happening without dubbing. But the film is almost fully dubbed, so it's more dubbed than King of the Monsters was, but it uses a similar device. It's not nearly as well written because oftentimes it comes off as pretentious the way the narrator talks. So it's weird to listen to. It's just watch the Japanese cut. There's no reason to watch Gigantus the Fire Monster. It's the same kind of B movie goodness as Godzilla Raids Again, except Godzilla Raids Again is a Godzilla movie and Gigantus isn't. And also Gigantus sounds like the name of an insect. It doesn't sound like a Godzilla kind of monster name. Also, there's a lot of atomic explosion, Cold War narration towards the beginning of the film, trying to hint at some kind of allegory, but it just comes off as 50s B-movie stereotype. So 1959, there's no need to watch it. It's just a dubbed version of Raids Again that isn't even a Godzilla movie. My one big criticism of the American cut is that Godzilla and Anguirus have the same roar. It's really weird to listen to. In that they give Godzilla Anguirus' roar, and Anguirus has his roar throughout the entire film. And Godzilla only gets his traditional roar in like 3 places. So it's really awkward. In the Japanese cut, it's not that way, but in Gigantus the Fire Monster, it's just terrible. So watch the Japanese cut. There's no reason to watch Gigantus. I give the Japanese cut a 3 out of 5. If you're a Godzilla completionist, I say check it out just for completing the series. Otherwise, skip it. There's just nothing in it. So that way you can move on to the real jewel of early Godzilla films. So that'll about do it for Raids Again. So as I said a few seconds ago, we're going to be moving on to my true jewel of the early Godzilla films. When we get into the film that started my Godzilla craze and many other people's Godzilla craze, drumroll please, when we review both the Japanese and English cuts of King Kong vs. Godzilla. I'll see you all tomorrow for those reviews. Thank you very much for watching. Sayonara.